I'm very happy to be back at Rieti. During my 30 years at OECD, I had many opportunities to present our OECD economic outlooks. And after leaving OECD, I decided to put it all into one book, try to summarize what I've done over 30 years. So today I would like to talk about some main points. Let me summarize at the beginning. First of all, I'd like to talk about the demographic challenge facing Japan with a falling population and an increasing share of elderly in the population. And then talk about what this means for the commitment Japan has made to provide universal health and long-term care to the elderly. Meeting this commitment requires a comprehensive strategy to, first of all, address the demographic situation. Second, to try to limit the decline in the labor force by making more use of women and older persons, as well as foreign workers. And third, try to boost labor productivity from a relatively low level. And fourth, to try to reform the health and long-term care systems to make them more efficient. And finally, to talk about fiscal policies to address government debt. So my presentation will talk about demographics, and then the labor force, productivity, health and long-term care, and fiscal situation. So first, as you are probably aware, Japan is a relatively old country now, with the share of elderly, 65 plus, accounting for about 48%, the size of the working age population, 15 to 64. Now, Korea is a young population, but it will overtake Japan, and some other European countries will come close to Japan. But I think Japan is really a front runner in addressing demographic change. So I think Japan has a great role to teach other countries how to address these challenges. The thing that strikes me about Japan is that the demographic transition is very rapid. So it took only 24 years from 1970 to 1994 for the share of elderly to increase from 7% to 14%. But in contrast, that took 115 years in France, 86 years in Sweden, and 72 years in the United States. And then it took only 12 years to go from 14% elderly to 20%. So Japan stands out for the rapid pace of population aging. So by 2060, we expect the population to fall by about a quarter to about 93 million, and the share of elderly to rise to 39%. So I should say at the beginning, there's nothing intrinsically bad about having fewer people. It means less pollution, less greenhouse gas emissions, less congestion. But the problem is the rapid pace of aging will make it difficult to provide the social safety net, especially for elder people. So if we look at the aging problem, it starts with fertility, which is a big topic right now with the Prime Minister talking about this quite a bit. So Japan's fertility rate hit a low point in 2005 at only 1.25. It edged up through 2015, but now we're back on a downward trend even before the pandemic started. So what explains falling fertility? Well, there's a recent working paper by the NBER that talked about some of the factors. So what explains, traditionally we had a negative relationship between fertility and GDP per capita, and that reflected a quantity-quality trade-off. As parents got richer, they invested more in quality, which is expensive, so they had fewer children. The second idea was that as wages increase and women get more education, they join the labor force and the opportunity cost of childcare rises. So that means more women working, but less fertility. But in recent years, we are finding that fertility behavior in high-income countries is driven by the degree of compatibility between women's careers and families. And without such compatibility, more women choose to have fewer or no children. So in advanced countries, we see a positive relationship between fertility and female employment. So in Nordic countries and some Anglo-Saxon countries, we have both high female employment, high fertility, whereas in some Southern European countries, Italy, Spain come to mind, we have low female employment and low fertility. So what can we do to improve the compatibility of women's careers and families? This same paper I mentioned by the NBER talks about 4 factors. One is family policies. public social spending, services, in-kind benefits, tax benefits for children. Japan is at the low end of OECD countries in this regard, spending 1.6% of GDP compared to the OECD average of 2.4. The second factor they mention is social norms, what is acceptable to society. And one of the first terms I learned coming to Japan was kyoiku mama, the responsibility that falls largely on mothers to get their children from school to juku and then into a good university. A third factor is having flexible labor markets. In Japan, the segmentation of labor markets between regular and non-regular makes it difficult for women to move between household and family responsibilities into the labor market. And fourth, it depends on fathers. And that's an area where things are changing, but still probably room to improve. So first of all, the government every 5 years takes a poll of couples, and they ask them, what is your ideal number of children? And what is your intended number? And you can see that the black bar, the ideal number is still quite high. 2.3 is the ideal. But the intended number is somewhat lower, but still close to replacement at 2.0. But the actual number falls short in the sample. And so the issue is, how can we remove the obstacles that prevent families from having their ideal, or at least their intended number of children? So they give various reasons why they don't achieve this intended number or ideal number. So I grouped them into three categories. One is economic. It's the high cost of childcare and education, and also the interruption or problems with the career. Then the health issues are also very important. The problems of having give birth at a later age and various health issues. And the third category relates to husbands. Are they involved in the burden of having children? So talking about the burden, the OECD takes statistics on everything, including how much people work at home in unpaid labor. So this refers to childcare and house cleaning, housework. And so in Japan, women on average spend 3 hours and 41 minutes each day on unpaid work, and men spend about 41 minutes. So that means there's about a 3-hour gap, which is rather wide. And of course, in the defense of men, giving long working hours in Japan and long commutes, it does make it difficult to make a big contribution. We also have parental leave, which in Japan is very generous, 1 year for men, 1 year for women. But still the share of men taking parental leave is quite low. In 2018, it was only around 6%. That means only 7% of parents taking parental leave were the fathers, whereas in some countries, the share of men or the fathers might be 30 or 40%. So young people facing financial challenges, the challenges of debt, of education costs, of low salaries, are tending to put off or delay marriage. So if we look back to 1970 in this chart, the green square, for men 30 to 34, back in 1970, only 11% were single, not married. Now it's about 50%. And we've seen a similar rise for women in the share that are not married. So the mean age at first marriage has risen to over 30 for men and close to 30 for women. And that implies that the age of having the first child is up to 32. So in Japan, we find that 98% of children are born inside of marriage, only 2% outside. And so the delayed or no marriage at all is having a severe impact on the birth rate. And one solution that I'll come to is trying to improve the financial situation of young people so they feel optimistic and courageous to get married and start a family. So let me turn to the labor force issues, starting with women. People still say, sometimes incorrectly, that Japan's female employment rate is low. But since 2011, we've had 2.9 million women come into the labor force. So the employment rate went from 60% in 2011 up to over 70%, and that's higher than the OECD average. And this is driven, of course, by labor shortages. We've had a persistent shortage in terms of the job offer to applicant ratio. It's averaged about 1.6. If we look at the lower panel, panel B, we can see the gender gap in employment is still quite wide. It's 13 percentage points. The male employment rate is 13 points higher than for women. So there is still scope for improving the quantity of female employment. Then we turn to the issue of quality of employment. And there we see the gender wage gap in Japan at about 23% is the third highest in the OECD. So this can discourage women who might consider working if the pay is that low. So what drives the low wage for women? Well, one factor is non-regular employment, the labor market duality. So on the right-hand side, we have women, and about 56% of them are non-regular, which means part-time, fixed-term, or atypical workers. As for men, only about 23% are non-regular. So in other words, women account for almost 2/3 of non-regular workers. And this is a big disadvantage because if you look at hourly wages, for regular workers, it grows up rapidly during their career, given seniority-based wages. And so by the time people are in their 50s, the regular workers are making more than double per hour than non-regular workers. And in practice, the situation is even worse because this doesn't include bonus payments, which still account for about 1/4 of employees' salaries. So regular workers mainly receive bonuses, but only about 1/3 of non-regular workers receive the bonus. So there's a big income gap. Prime Minister Abe said in 2017 he wanted, quote, to make the term non-regular employment be swept away from Japan. And so if you look at why do we have non-regular workers, the government takes a poll of firms and saying, why do you hire them? So 39% of firms said we hire them because they're less expensive. It's a way of reducing our labor costs. 33% of firms said we need more flexible workforce in order to adjust to the business cycle. So one of the keys is to have more employment flexibility, which means addressing the issue of employment protection. So just jumping ahead, the recommendation that OECD has made is that we need a comprehensive strategy to reduce dualism by increasing the coverage of social insurance for non-regular and training programs, and relaxing or reducing employment protection for regular workers. So the goal would be not to protect jobs, but to protect people. And this is the famous flex security model that is popular in Scandinavia, especially in Denmark. So another issue in the gender wage gap is discrimination. And so the goal was to have women occupy 30% of leadership positions by 2020, but in 2018, it was still very low at 14%, the lowest after Korea in the OECD. And this extends also to politics, where in the Diet, in the lower house, just under 10% of the members of the Diet are women. And in Europe, we see rates of 30 to 40% for women. So discrimination is still an issue. So let me turn now to the question of older workers. And this is very important. Between 1970 and 2000, for men, the rate was trending down for people above 60. Since 2000, it started to move up because older workers have more education. Work is less strenuous. There's less blue-collar jobs. And the pension eligibility age has been raised. So we see a trend of men and also women working past the age of 60. But there's still scope to increase that because polls show that many people want to work to 65, 70, and sometimes even beyond. The government in 1998 prohibited companies from setting mandatory retirement below the age of 60. But still, the latest data I could find in 2016, about 4/5 of companies still set mandatory retirement at 60. And that seems a bit out of date or anachronistic given Japan's long life expectancy, 81 years for men, 87 for women. And what happens in 2013, the government said workers at age 60 should have a chance to continue with the firm. But what that means in practice is the implicit lifelong contract is broken and people become non-regular workers. So the share of men as non-regular goes from 10% in the 55-59 age group, up to nearly 60% by the time they're in the later 60s. And for women as well, we see a rise in non-regular. So this isn't the optimal approach, because somebody in a responsible position might become a non-regular worker and decide, why not just retire instead? And so we want to make employment attractive for people even after they reach age 60. I think the key problem in Japan is a seniority-based wage system. And so we see on the left-hand side large firms. If you compare the wage at 55, 59, it's 2.8 times higher than for young people 20 to 24. So the link between wage and seniority in Japan is the strongest among the 38 OECD countries. And now with the new policy, you can see the dotted line after the change in 2013, the wage for 60-64 drops about 40% once you get past age 60. So this is not the way to increase the employment of elderly people. So in summary, the policies that I've recommended to help people extend their working lives, if they wish, is first to abandon or abolish mandatory retirement. That sounds maybe a bit shocking, but coming from my background as an American, it's a human rights issue. Why should people have to retire because they reach a certain age? And second, the pension eligibility age, which is relatively young, it will only reach 65 in 2025 for men and 2030 for women, it should be raised higher. And that will encourage people to continue their careers. We should change the wage system so that we give less weight to seniority and give more weight to the job type and performance. And of course, this is not necessarily popular with workers, but it'd be a more efficient way to have workers rewarded. And fourth, we need to increase lifelong learning so that older people are able to adapt to a more digital, high-tech economy. And finally, we need more work-life balance so people don't burn out and are working such long hours early on, and we don't have problems of bad health and karoshi as people get older. And the final issue is a question of foreign workers. And in Japan, the share of foreign workers in the labor force is about 2%. And so there's great scope to increase that. As we all know, in 2019, we introduced the specific skill work program, which allows foreign workers in 14 industries with labor shortages, such as long-term care, agriculture, construction, allowed to come for 5 years on a work visa and work in Japan. We had the COVID pandemic, which made it very hard to bring workers in, but hopefully this program will be effective. The government expected that it would bring 350,000 workers by 2023. Now, of course, there's increasing competition for foreign workers. Korea faces very severe shortages in their SME sector, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so Japan will have to compete with other countries. And as a good friend said once, it would be a shame if Japan tries to get more foreign workers and nobody comes. So we have to attract these workers to come to Japan. So let me turn to my third topic, which is productivity growth. And so most people, when I talk about Japan and the US, they think of Japan as a very high-tech, innovative, high productivity economy. But when we compare labor productivity, which is simply total GDP divided by total hours worked, Japan's productivity is about 28% below the top half of OECD. So the OECD has 36 countries when I did this, and so it means comparing Japan to the top 18 OECD countries. And so Japan has large labor inputs, but relatively low productivity. As labor inputs drop with shorter working hours and a falling population and labor force, it'll become ever more essential that productivity be increased. So what is the problem? For me, part of it is the polarization of the Japanese economy. If we look at the gap between small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, compared to large companies, the gap is wide. In this figure, firms with 20 to 49 workers are compared to firms with 250 or more. So there in Japan, the gap is more than 55%, relatively high. Also, we don't have dynamic small companies. So in this chart, we compare firms with less than 50 workers by the age of the firm. So you can see Japan on the left-hand side. In red, about 75% of small firms are more than 10 years old. Where looking at France, in the middle, only about 42% of small firms are more than 10 years old, and about 24% are startups. And we don't usually think of France as a dynamic, creative economy, but this is key because getting bigger and growing is a key to increasing productivity through economies of scale, and also not having non-viable firms continue to operate and occupy space. One of the reasons for a large number of SMEs that don't grow is the government gives large-scale support to SMEs. This figure just shows government guarantees for SME loans, but SMEs also benefit from lower tax rates and other policies as well. So we sometimes say that SMEs have a Peter Pan problem. They don't want to go up and lose the benefits of being small. The problem of SMEs is also linked to service sector productivity, because 2/3 of SMEs are in the service sector. And so it's the same, two sides of the same coin. So if we compare service sector productivity, in Japan it's 68% that of manufacturing. The OECD average is about 84%. And in some countries, services are even more important. Services are now about 65% of the Japanese economy. And with aging, the share of services will rise. So it's crucial that we improve the productivity of the service sector to improve living standards and sustain economic growth. So looking back to 1994, we can see manufacturing productivity has increased quite strongly, and service sector productivity peaked in about 2008, just before the world crisis, and then it's basically stagnated. So manufacturing, of course, tends to be more productive because they compete more in international trade. They have other advantages, but by using digital technology, it should be possible to improve productivity in the service sector. One of the problems in services and in SMEs is a lack of innovation. So if we look at R&D spending by the business sector, the second line is SMEs. So SMEs in Japan account for only 8% of business sector R&D. OECD average is 40%. The sixth line down is the services total. And there, the service sector only has 10% of R&D, business R&D, and the OECD average is 20%. So service sector is 2/3 of output, but only 10% of R&D. So we need to make our SME and service sector more dynamic and innovative. So let me just say a word about innovation in Japan. There are many strong points. If we look at triadic patent families, patents filed in US, Europe, and Japan, Japan is number one. Japan is very high in patent applications. Patents in ICT, biotech are very high. On the other hand, we have some weaker points. Japan is not very internationally integrated in the global R&D system. If we look at international co-authorship and inventing, it's relatively low. And public sector R&D and basic R&D, which is the source of future innovation, is relatively low in Japan. So there are ways to try to improve the overall innovation system. If we look at the funding for R&D, the fourth line is business enterprise. They account for almost 4/5 of R&D. 98.9% of that R&D takes place within the business sector. Only 0.5% is in universities. The universities are where the PhDs in the STEM areas are located. So not involving SMEs, universities, is a problem. Universities account for only 5% of R&D spending. And so ideally we would have a system where universities, government research institutes, and the business sector would be working together cooperatively to try to advance technology. And then, as I mentioned before, the foreign sources are very low at 0.6%. We look at the share of workers who are in ICT intensive occupations. Japan is quite low. So we have a high level of ICT patents, a high level of ICT investment, but not many workers using ICT. I think the problem is the ICT technology doesn't filter down from the big companies down to the SMEs, who account for about 72% of firms in Japan. So let me briefly talk about the healthcare sector. Japan's healthcare system is very good. Having lived here and comparing to the US system, I find many good things to say about Japan's healthcare system. The healthcare spending has risen quite strongly from about 6% in 1990 up to about 11%, still slightly above the OECD average, but far below that in the United States. So the government, in their study, comparing 2000 to 2016, there was a 12 trillion yen rise in healthcare spending. Aging accounted for about 2/3 of that increase. So we find that about that healthcare spending on people over age 65 is about 6 times higher than for people under age 65. So aging is driving increased spending, and also the increase in cost per person, that's technology. So higher tech medical care is driving up costs. The government estimates by 2060, healthcare spending and long-term care for the elderly will rise another 5% of GDP, which will put increased fiscal pressure. If you look at the international comparison of healthcare in Japan to OECD averages, we do find lots of areas for improvement. So first of all, the number of doctor consultations each year, Japan 12.8, the OECD average 7.4. And I think this reflects the fee-for-service system, where each time you go to the doctor, you pay the fee, rather than a performance-related fee. The hospital stay, 28 days, 28.5 days, highest in OECD. That reflects social hospitalization, which means elderly people who might not really need medical care, but need help with day-to-day living, end up in hospitals. So we have a very long hospital stay. If we take out the social hospitalization and look at acute care, it's still the longest in OECD, 16.5 days. And we have a large number of hospitals, a large number of acute care, and a large number of total. And so it seems that, in this case, that supply is creating a demand. We have a study done by the Cabinet Office, and it compares the number of hospital beds per capita by prefecture. And you can see that Kanagawa-ken on the left-hand side has less than 10, whereas in, I think, Kochi, the other side, is close to 50. And we find that prefectures that have a large number of beds per capita have a large number of people going to the hospital. And we have higher healthcare spending per capita. So one of the keys is to try to reduce the number of hospitals and shift them more towards long-term care facilities that will provide for elderly who don't really need the health care. For looking ahead, what's going to help is to try to increase the healthy lifespan. So Japan estimates that for men, the healthy lifespan is 71 years. For women, I think it's 75. In prefectures where you have healthy lifespan, a long healthy lifespan, you get lower healthcare costs. And on the right-hand side, you see that the employment rate for people 65 and above is higher when we have longer healthy lifespans. So that means trying to improve healthy habits, trying to not have problems of obesity, of heart problems, of diabetes, and that. So that will be a key, trying to limit the increase in healthcare spending. So just in summary, I focused on the payment systems. In hospitals, we need to use the diagnosis procedure combination, changing fee for service to pay for performance, using more generic drugs, and shifting long-term care out of hospitals into mainly home-based care. So let me finish talking about the fiscal situation. And this is becoming an increasing concern. The finance minister, Mr. Suzuki, last Monday spoke to the Diet, and he talked about how severe the situation is becoming. So back in 1990, Japan's gross government debt was about 60% of GDP. So Japan would have qualified for the European Union's Maastricht criteria of being in a very healthy situation. Over time, it's risen rapidly. When I came in the 2000s during the Koizumi time, we would say 150%. This is way too high. It's going to be problematic. But it kept rising. We got to 242% in 2020, and the OECD projects that it will reach 252% by next year. What is causing higher debt? One reason is public social spending. So this is the healthcare, long-term care, pensions, social welfare. So Japan, it went from 11% up to about 23% because of the population aging. Korea, the country I've also worked on, has had the same trend, but they're back where Japan was in 1990. But for them, because they have even faster aging, they're going to hit 25% by 2060. So this is a common problem in these aging Asian economies. So if we look at government spending and government revenue, it peaked in 2009 as the government tried to offset the global financial crisis. And then during that decade, we had a gradual downward trend in government spending during Abenomics time. Government revenue, meanwhile, was able to increase by about 6 points of GDP because we had faster economic growth, and we had the tax hikes in 2014 and again in 2019. But you can see the deficit, which was as large as 10% back in the late 90s and again in 2008, 2009, it got down to about 3% of GDP. We had a target to reach balance by 2020, but it shows we're not going to make it. So how did Japan reduce spending? Well, the second line, you can see social spending increased as a share of central government general account spending by 5.6%. Most other categories have been squeezed. Less spending on education and science, less spending on national defense, less spending on infrastructure. But we know you can't always squeeze these things because we need education and science. And we have a plan to double defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027. So this really isn't the long-term solution to try to cut everything else and let social spending continue to increase. So this 2010, the government set this target, reached a small surplus by 2020, a small primary balance, and this is general government excluding social insurance. So we were on track till 2018, then the government delayed the target to 2025. With the sharp increase in spending to deal with COVID, the deficit became very large. The OECD estimates that by 2023, the deficit will be 6% of GDP. So it doesn't seem very realistic to go from -6 to 0 in just 2 years. That might cause a severe downturn. But I think the government needs to have a realistic, achievable target that they can aim to try to get the primary balance and then to gradually put government debt on a downward trend. It's not a question of getting it back to 100%. It's just to get it on a downward trend. There's going to be increasing pressure because of aging. This looks at municipalities. And on the left-hand side, you can see that as population density declines, you move to the left, per capita spending goes up. And this is going to be a problem because Japan has many areas where population is falling. We're having what you call ghost towns, even in the Kanto area, not too far from Tokyo. And I visited Yubari. Their population went from 120 down to 9. It's very hard to finance local government in that situation. The right-hand side is per capita spending as the share of elderly increases. And as we expect, as the population gets older, spending goes up. So there's going to be continued pressure on government spending. The other issue that bothers me or worries me is pensions, the pension system. So the OECD measure of replacement shows that the Japanese pension system will provide benefits that are about 37% of the working age income. And that's relatively low. And that means there'll be a significant share of elderly who might end up in poverty. Right now, elderly poverty, relative poverty, defined as income below half the national median, that's about 20% in Japan, but that will tend to go up. So we have to make the pension system sustainable and try to ensure the elderly don't fall into poverty. So what's the best way to fix the pension system? Well, you have three options. One is to raise the contribution rate. In Japan, that's already quite high at 17.6% of wages. You can lower the benefits, but as I mentioned, the benefits are already quite low. So the key is to try to raise the pension eligibility age. So Japan is planning to go to 65, but in my view, I'd recommend it goes higher to 68 and then to 70. And under each of the scenarios in this Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare simulation, the replacement rate goes up by about 20 points by extending the working life. So far, government debt is high and rising, but the impact on interest payments has been relatively low. So Japan spends only about 0.4% of GDP on net interest payments. United States spends about 3% because even though their debt is much lower, the interest rates are higher. So Japan has kept the interest payments low because we have the Bank of Japan targeting long-term 10-year government bond yields at 0. So that has kept the interest cost quite low. But as we all know, inflation has increased quite a bit. And now we're talking a lot in the press and in the diet even about an exit from quantitative easing and yield curve control. And already on December 20th, there was a very important decision at the Bank of Japan to widen the band for the zero target from 25 basis points up to 50 basis points. So that implies that the borrowing rate for the government could increase significantly in the near future. So when you have debt of 250% of GDP, if the effective borrowing rate goes up by 1 percentage point, that increases the deficit by 2.5% of GDP. So we can see how difficult the situation is. So many people, especially in Europe, for example, say, well, the solution is easy. Japan's a low-tax country. Just raise the revenue, and you can solve these problems. But that's not easy, both politically, and there are economic costs to becoming a high-tax country. So first of all, what tax do you increase? The OECD likes to rank taxes based on their impact on economic growth. So the best option is environment taxes because that improves the environment. A second is property tax because there's few distortions with property. And third is consumption tax. And there, Japan gets only about 1/5 of revenue from the consumption tax, which is a VAT. The personal income tax is another way to get money. Japan has high personal income tax rates, but low revenue because the income tax base is very narrow, not broad. Social Security contributions, that's already high because the 17.6% contribution rate. The corporate income tax rate has come down from 39% down to 29.84. I would recommend broadening the base and not necessarily raising the rate because that has negative side effects on foreign direct investment. If we look at the VAT, 10% in Japan, OECD average is about almost 20%. If you raise the VAT by 2 points, you get 1% of GDP in revenue. So if we need 5% of revenue, you'd have to have a 20% VAT, basically the average in Europe. And I'd also recommend having a single rate because having two rates leads to distortions. Having a lower rate for food actually helps high-income households because they have a higher quantity of spending on food, so the lower rate helps them more than it helps the lower-income people. So we need to address the regressive aspect in a different way. On the personal income tax base, the problem is we exclude about 30% of wage income. So only around half, less than half, of wage earnings are taxed. And this is intended to level the playing field between the self-employed and the employees. So I think we need more transparency by my number system, and we need to try to tax a broader base of income, broader share of income. And finally, we need more environmental tax. Japan has a relatively low share of environmentally related tax. The government is talking about 2028 for introducing more carbon taxes. Given that we have a 46% target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and carbon neutral by 2050, I think it would be very useful to start earlier to try to raise the carbon tax. So let me stop here, and I look forward to more comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Well,